I think it's time we blow this scene. Get everybody in this stuff together. Okay, 3, 2, 1, let's jam. Oh, I wish I could have actually kicked in the music after that without, risking getting this whole thing flagged under somebody else's copyright, but I can't. So there we go. All right, so yeah. A few days ago, and I would have jumped on this sooner, but I didn't want to rearrange the stuff I'd already planned for the rest of last week. It was announced that Netflix is moving forward with a live-action adaptation of Cowboy Bebop. I shouldn't have to talk too much about my feelings about live-action adaptations of animated works in general because, my thoughts that I gave about Disney remaking its animated films as live-action applies here as well. So, you can look to that to see how I feel it denigrates animation as an art form in general because it reemphasizes the idea that live-action is the quote-unquote real version. But beyond that, it's very odd to me that Netflix especially is jumping on that, given how not very well received the Netflix Death Note movie was. Now, to be fair, I haven't seen Death Note. I have no idea how good it was or wasn't, or how good of a representation of the original work it was or wasn't. People really didn't seem to like it, though. Of course, whether or not people like it and whether or not it actually got the returns that that Netflix wanted are two completely different conversations. And unfortunately, talking about these sorts of things with Netflix, we are hamstrung by the fact that Netflix doesn't put its viewing numbers out. When it comes to something like, say, the Transformers movies, we can go, boy, a lot of people seem to really not like this, but then we can look at the box office and go, that's why they keep making it. So we can, I could presume that Death Note pulled in decent viewing numbers despite the reception, but I also don't know. So I have to at the very least assume that the bad fan reception was not reflected in low viewing numbers. Whether or not those viewing numbers were super high or not, I don't know. That would be a blind guess. But I have to presume that, part of the reason fans were as angry about it as they were is because they all watched it. Which, is one of the things that early on in these kinds of cycles, these studios can kind of count on. Where, if it's something that we don't have, even if it stinks, at least initially, we have a tendency to flock to it if it's something we think we want, even if it's bad, because it's all we've got. Now, that doesn't last. You go too long giving us just crap versions. Eventually, we stop giving you the benefit of the doubt. We stop tuning in. But obviously, Netflix wouldn't have hit that period yet. But let's just talk about the general concept of doing Cowboy Bebop specifically, because talking about doing anime stories as live action is a little bit of a weird thing to talk about because they actually do it a lot in Japan. And I don't know enough about the culture over there to really kind of parse that, because the little bits I've seen of those live action movies they just seem really, really weird, because more often than not they actually adapt things that are specific to the anime visual sensibility and do them anyway, even though it now makes no sense because you're not in an exaggerated art style. You're dealing with real people, but they're still behaving the way the animated characters. It's weird, and I just have to assume cultural difference on that. But, Netflix is not doing this as a Japanese project. They're doing it as an American one. So, like I said, I'm not going to talk the broader idea of adapting animes in general because, like I said, there's a whole, thing going on with that I just don't know about. So, Cowboy Bebop specifically, there have been rumors of Cowboy Bebop getting some kind of adaptation for a long time. When the thing was first, getting big over here and airing on Adult Swim, fair number of people were throwing out Keanu Reeves to play Spike, which, at the time, 15 years ago, okay, yep, maybe. Now I'm no. But beyond that, there's a basic fundamental weird thing about trying to do a live action version of Cowboy Bebop, whether you're doing it as a movie or a series, which I think is why it's stalled so many times up to this point. And actually, I think extrapolates out in general. It's probably a big part of why the live action remake of Akira has stalled as many times as it has, which is that one of the inherent benefits of animation in general is that you can do something, you are not nearly as confined by budget. If you can draw it, you can have it. You can have massive robots, huge space creatures, insane monsters, transformations of people into demons, all this stuff, and it doesn't cost you any more than it does to, you know, just animate people walking down the street. Well, I mean, it does, because if you want to do it well, it's more frames of animation, it's more time, whatever. But my point is, the cost of doing something visually extravagant it's a much less of a bump doing it in animation versus trying to achieve that in live action. So the thing about something like Cowboy Bebop specifically is Cowboy Bebop, for how expensive it would be to realize it accurately, you know, all the space stuff, the pace of it, all of the locations, the visual aesthetic, that kind of stuff is not cheap to realize in live action, to realize visually convincingly, because you have to if you're doing it live action, otherwise what's the point? It looks like a cartoon again. But the thing about Cowboy Bebop is it doesn't have a story to scale up to that expense, because the general feeling that most studios, American studios at least, tend to have in approaching these things is the scope of a story should in some way reflect the amount of money they're spending. It's why they spend way less money on small dramatic films than they do on epic, comic book, space, whatevers. I mean, partly it's what can you get away with spending, but it's really hard to find large-scale, big-budget, visually extravagant films that also tell small stories. Hollywood doesn't really do that as a rule, because if they're going to spend that much money, the feeling is we should be telling an epic story. We should be telling a Lord of the Rings level story. Like, the best example I can think that doesn't do that is something like, say, Blade Runner. Both of them, honestly. The first one a little bit more, though, which is that it's a huge world. Massive, expansive. It's a really small story, which is one of the things I love about it. And it's one of the reasons it's one of my favorite films, because I can't find that in too many places when it comes to film or just live action in general. In animation, you can do that. So Cowboy Bebop, for all of the space adventure and wacky weapons and all the stuff going on, it's really small stories. It's just these bounty hunters going after this one, this bounty, that bounty. Sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. Usually, even if they get it, the payday's not what it should have been. And the few quote-unquote bigger things it does are still really contained. They're really personal. Even if you want to try and blow up something like, say, Spike's story into something bigger, it doesn't really lend itself to that. His story is, first of all, for me, actually not one of the better elements of the show, but is not grand and operatic. It's still relatively small, but it's personal. Same thing if you're gonna dive into Jet or Faye. Not really so much Ed, because we don't do a deep dive into Ed. That would be weird. But these stories aren't big, but you would have to spend a lot of money. And I think that's been the general hiccup on these. I think it's why a live action movie didn't happen before. I think it's why when this was previously proposed as being a show over with Amazon, they never moved on it. Because I think there's a disconnect between how these studios view the amount of money it's going to cost them to spend versus what's the story that's actually being told. So I figure there's one of a couple ways this could go, none of which I'm particularly interested in. I mean, I'd reserve the right to, based off trailer or first episode or whatever, to be turned around. I'd like to be. I like it when my cynicism is proven wrong. I don't like having it confirmed. But to my way of thinking, there's a couple of ways this could go. Either they scale up in accordance with what it would cost them to realize this well, in which case they're basically just going to turn Cowboy Bebop into Star Wars, which we don't need. or they're going to trim the budget back and we're going to lose the sense of scope that they're going to treat it like something like Firefly. A whole bunch of bottle episodes confined to the ship, single location stories, avoid the scope of it. Because that's how you would contain the budget. And let's be honest, Netflix, for as big as they are not known for extravagant spending. Like, the one time they notably spent a lot of money was Sense8, and that was so expensive for them that they basically had to be bullied into doing the, closing out the story. They wanted to just cancel it. So I don't envision a situation where Netflix, well, I have a hard time believing they would spend the money necessary to accurately recreate this story and this world and these characters in the first place. Even if they do, I don't know how well they're going to be able to resist the studio gut instinct of being sure the story is as massive as the budget. And then it just wouldn't be Cowboy Bebop anymore. I mean, it's possible. It's possible that they find a way to give us just enough that it looks right and it looks convincing, but they manage to not spend so much that they feel the need to mess with the story. Because, I mean, ultimately, that's always the thing. The more money gets spent, the more the people at the top tend to micromanage. That's why Warner Brothers is such a mess right now, because they decided 3-4 years ago or so that they were basically going to stop making mid-budget movies and we're only going to make huge blockbusters. And then it's studio interference right and left, because when you're spending $200 million on a movie, you're going to keep a really close eye on it. And then it just, it's become a mess. So, I mean, ultimately, whether or not this has any shot at being any good is going to depend on how much money they're willing to throw at it. But if they do trim the budget back so much that they're willing to let a director or writer or whatever, have the creative freedom that they want, is there going to be enough money to actually have it look like Cowboy Bebop? Have it feel like Cowboy Bebop? I don't know. I can't help but be cynical about this. And I might not have talked about it, except that, I am in the middle of revisiting Cowboy Bebop for a podcast, which I will have a link to down below. I put links up for that in the community feed for this channel, so you can see those there too. But yeah, the timing was funny as far as that goes, but I'll leave it off at that. Cowboy Bebop, live action, Netflix. What do you think about this? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do because there's buttons and there's links, including one to my Patreon if you are feeling generous. If not, don't worry about it. Other links you can check out. Don't want to check those out? That's okay too, because at the end of the day, folks, you are the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.